Don't take another bite. The words were soft, almost lost beneath the gentle clink of silverware and the low hum of conversations wrapped in money and quiet judgment. Ethan Caldwell paused, knife hovering just above a perfectly seared 16-ounce ribeye, the kind that cost more than most people's daily wage. The steak glistened under warm amber light, juices pooling like liquid gold across a porcelain plate imported from Italy. Around him, the restaurant breathed wealth. Crystal glasses shimmered. A pianist in the corner pressed slow, deliberate notes into the air. Waiters moved like shadows trained not to exist. And yet, in that moment, everything narrowed to the small square of paper now resting beneath his fingers. He hadn't seen her place it. 1 second, the plate arrived. The next, the note was there. Clean. Folded. Intentional. Ethan didn't look up right away. He didn't need to. He already knew who it was. Naomi. The waitress no one remembered calling. The one who refilled water before anyone noticed it was gone. The one whose eyes lingered just a second longer than they should, not out of curiosity, but calculation. Invisible, but never unaware. He picked up the note slowly, as if the weight of it mattered. As if the room might shift if he moved too fast. The paper unfolded with a quiet whisper. 8 words. That was all. This meat was recalled 6 hours ago. The knife lowered. Not dropped. Not slammed. Just lowered. Controlled. Ethan's jaw tightened, not in panic, but in recognition. Across the room, laughter continued. A man in a navy suit raised his bourbon glass. A woman adjusted a diamond bracelet that caught the light like a signal flare. No one stopped. No one noticed. But Ethan did. Because Ethan Caldwell wasn't just another diner enjoying a $95 steak. He was the man who owned a majority stake in the very supply chain that delivered it. The farms. The distributors. The contracts signed behind closed doors with numbers that didn't fit on a single page. Systems built on precision, control, trust. And if that note was true, even partially, then something inside that system had broken. He lifted his eyes, just slightly. Not enough to draw attention, just enough to see her. Naomi stood near the service station, posture straight, expression neutral, as if she had never said a word in her life. But her gaze didn't meet his. Not directly. She was watching the room. The kitchen doors. The manager who suddenly seemed too attentive, too quick to smile, too eager to move. Ethan folded the note again, slower this time. Not out of hesitation. Out of understanding. Because this wasn't a mistake. It was a message. And messages like this didn't come from guesses. They came from knowledge. The kind you earn. Or the kind you pay for. He set the knife down beside the plate. The steak still steamed. Perfect. Untouched. And for the first time that night, Ethan Caldwell realized something he hadn't planned for. He didn't need to test the restaurant anymore. The test had already begun. And the only person who knew the rules was the one no one bothered to see. Ethan did not call the waiter. He did not raise his hand or signal for a manager. He simply sat there, still as stone, while the world around him carried on as if nothing had changed. Because to everyone else, nothing had. The steak was still perfect. The wine still breathed in its glass. The music still flowed like silk through the room. But to Ethan, every detail had shifted half an inch out of place. He reached for his glass of Cabernet, lifted it just enough to buy himself a second, and let his eyes drift again without moving his head. The kitchen doors swung open and closed in a steady rhythm. Plates went in. Plates came out. Precision. Timing. Training. And yet, something in that rhythm felt forced now, like a performance that had practiced too well. His mind moved faster than his body ever would. 6 hours ago. A recall that recent would not be public yet. Not widely. It would exist in emails, internal alerts, systems only a handful of people could access in real time. Which meant one thing. Naomi did not guess. She knew. Ethan set the glass down gently, the soft tap against the table almost lost beneath the piano. He adjusted his posture, leaning back slightly, the way a man does when he is no longer here for dinner, but for answers. Across the room, Naomi moved again. Smooth. Measured. She refilled a water glass at another table, nodded politely, stepped aside before anyone could thank her. Invisible. Except now, she was the only person Ethan could see clearly. The manager appeared near the bar, speaking quickly to a server, his smile too wide, his eyes too sharp. He glanced toward Ethan's table, just for a second, then looked away. That was enough. People who had nothing to hide never checked twice. Ethan reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone, but he did not unlock it. Not yet. Instead, he placed it face down on the table beside the untouched steak. A signal. A decision waiting to be made. Because if that note was true, this was no longer about a single dish. This was about a chain. A network. A system with his name buried deep inside contracts and ownership structures designed to stay invisible. The same way Naomi had been invisible. Until now. He picked up the note again, reading it a second time, slower. Not looking for new words, but for intent. There was no panic in it. No exaggeration. Just a statement. Clean. Precise. The way professionals communicate when there is no time for drama. Ethan exhaled quietly, then did something no one at that table expected, because no one was watching closely enough to understand what it meant. He slid the plate an inch away from him. Not much. Just enough. A decision made without a word. Across the room, Naomi saw it. She did not react. She did not smile. But for the first time, she allowed herself the smallest shift in posture. A breath released, a calculation confirmed. And in that silent exchange, something passed between them. Not trust. Not yet. But recognition. Because in a room full of power, status, and noise, two people who were never meant to matter had just taken control of everything that was about to happen next. The room did not change, but the truth inside it had already begun to shift. Ethan leaned back further in his chair, one arm resting lightly against the polished wood, his expression calm, almost indifferent, the kind of posture that belonged to a man with nothing to prove and everything to observe. But beneath that stillness, his mind was already moving through layers most people in that room would never even know existed. Supply routes, distribution timestamps, internal alert systems. A recall issued 6 hours ago would have triggered silent notifications across a closed network, flagged shipments, halted deliveries, rerouted inventory. That was how the system was designed. Efficient, controlled, accountable, unless someone chose to ignore it. His eyes moved again, slower this time, tracing the invisible lines between the kitchen doors and the tables being served. Plate after plate moved past him, identical cuts, identical presentation, each one carrying the same quiet question. How many of these should not be here? A server passed behind him, her tray balanced with practiced ease, and for a brief second, Ethan caught a glimpse of a label tucked beneath a folded cloth. White. Standard. Nothing unusual to anyone else. But to him, the absence of variation was the detail. High-end kitchens rotated suppliers constantly to maintain quality and exclusivity. Consistency at this level was not excellence. It was convenience. And convenience in a system built on precision usually meant corners had been cut somewhere no one expected to look. Across the room, Naomi moved again, but this time, her path shifted. She did not approach his table. Instead, she circled wider, passing near the kitchen entrance, her pace unchanged, her posture neutral. But as she passed, her eyes flicked once toward a stainless steel prep counter just inside the doorway. Quick, precise, intentional. Ethan followed that glance, not directly, but through reflection, catching the image in the mirrored panel behind the bar. Boxes, stacked too close, labels facing inward instead of out. That was not carelessness. That was concealment. He felt it then, not fear, not anger, but something colder. Clarity. Because this was no longer a question of whether something was wrong. It was a question of how far it reached. He reached for his phone again, this time turning it over, his thumb hovering just above the screen. One call. That was all it would take. One call, and this entire place would freeze. Inspections. Shutdowns. Headlines by morning. But Ethan did not move. Not yet. Because the system he had built did not fail loudly. It failed quietly, in places designed to be overlooked, by people trained to follow orders instead of question them. And tonight, the only person who had questioned anything was not a manager, not a chef, not an executive. It was the woman no one had bothered to see. Naomi stopped near the service station again, her hands steady as she aligned a row of glasses that were already perfectly straight. A meaningless action to anyone watching. But Ethan understood now. She was waiting. Not for him to panic. Not for him to react. She was waiting to see if he would understand. Because this was not just a warning. It was a test. And in that moment, Ethan Caldwell realized something that no balance sheet, no acquisition, No billion-dollar deal had ever forced him to confront. Power was not in the systems you controlled. It was in the truths you were willing to face when those systems failed. And the next move was his. If you are right, then this does not stay in this room. Ethan finally moved, his voice low, almost indistinguishable from the music, but it was enough. Naomi did not turn immediately. She finished placing the last glass in line, adjusted it by less than an inch, then walked toward his table with the same measured pace she had used all night. No rush, no fear, just control. She stopped at his side, not across from him, not confronting, just close enough for a quiet exchange to exist without being seen. "Would you like anything else, sir?" she asked, her tone perfectly neutral, the kind of question that meant nothing to anyone listening. Ethan did not look at her. His eyes stayed on the plate, untouched, cooling slowly under the dim lights. "How sure are you?" he asked, just as quietly. Naomi did not hesitate. "Sure enough that I would not serve it to you," she replied. No drama, no emphasis, just fact. That was what made it land. Ethan exhaled through his nose, a slow, controlled breath that carried more weight than any reaction he could have shown. Around them, the room continued its performance. A couple at the next table laughed softly. A server passed by with a tray of identical plates. The manager's voice carried faintly from the bar, polished, confident, rehearsed. Everything looked right. That was the problem. Ethan finally turned his head slightly, just enough to catch Naomi's profile. "Why tell me?" he asked. It was not suspicion. It was precision. Naomi's eyes stayed forward, focused somewhere past him, as if she were speaking into the air. "Because you are the only one here who might understand what it means," she said. Ethan's fingers tapped once against the edge of the table. Not impatience. Calculation. "And you think I do?" he asked. This time, Naomi allowed herself the smallest glance toward him. "Just a second. Just enough." "You stopped eating," she said. "That tells me everything." Silence settled between them. Not awkward, not heavy, just real. Two people standing in the middle of a system neither of them fully controlled, but both of them could see clearly. Ethan leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice even further. "If this came through internal channels, it should have been pulled already," he said. Naomi nodded once. "It should have," she agreed. But it was not. Ethan's gaze shifted again toward the kitchen, toward the hidden movement behind those swinging doors. "Then someone made a decision," he said. Naomi's expression did not change. "Yes," she replied. "Someone always does." The weight of that truth did not need explanation. In systems like his, failures were rarely accidents. They were choices. Quiet ones. Invisible ones. Made in moments where no one thought anyone was watching. Except someone always was. Ethan reached for his phone again, this time unlocking it, the screen lighting up his face for a brief second before he dimmed it. Names. Numbers. Access points. All within reach. All waiting. But he did not call. Not yet. Instead, he looked back at the plate, then gently pushed it another inch away, a clearer line drawn now. A boundary. Naomi saw it. She gave the slightest nod, almost imperceptible, then stepped back, returning to her role, her position, her invisibility. But something had changed. Not in the room. Not yet. In the balance. Because now, the man who built the system and the woman who saw through it were no longer separate parts of the same story. They were aligned. And somewhere behind those kitchen doors, the truth was still moving, still being served, still pretending to belong. But not for much longer. The decision did not explode. It settled. Quiet. Precise. Ethan tapped once on his phone, not to call, not to alert, but to open a secure internal dashboard that most people in his position never touched directly. Real-time shipment logs appeared, lines of data scrolling beneath his thumb, timestamps, distribution nodes, supplier codes. Clean. Organized. Perfect on the surface. But perfection, Ethan knew, was often where the truth learned to hide. He filtered the last 12 hours. Then 6. Then narrowed it to one specific supplier chain tied to this region. There it was. A flag batch. Marked. Not cleared. Not approved. And yet delivered. His jaw tightened slightly. Not anger. Not yet. Just confirmation. Across the room, another plate landed on a nearby table. Same cut. Same presentation. A man in a gray suit sliced into it without hesitation, smiling as if nothing in the world could possibly be wrong. Ethan watched for a second longer than necessary. Then he looked away, because this was no longer about one plate. This was about every plate that followed. He locked the phone and set it down again, slower this time, as if the weight of it had changed. Because it had. The system had not failed. Someone inside it had made a choice to ignore the failure. And that choice had traveled. Through hands. Through approvals. Through silence. Until it reached this table. Naomi moved again, passing behind him, her presence almost non-existent to everyone else. But Ethan could feel it now, the awareness she carried, the constant calculation behind every step. She stopped briefly at a nearby table, refilling a glass, her posture unchanged, her voice calm, but her eyes flicked once toward him. Not a question, not a signal, just acknowledgement. He had seen what she wanted him to see. Now the weight was his. Ethan leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the table, the untouched steak now nothing more than evidence sitting in plain sight. He could end it in seconds. One call. One message. Regulatory alerts. Immediate shutdown. That was the power he had built. Fast. Absolute. Final. But something held him there. Not hesitation. Intention. Because shutting it down would stop the moment. It would not expose the pattern. And patterns were where truth lived. His eyes moved again to the kitchen doors. Timing. Movement. Behavior. The manager had changed his rhythm. Subtle, but visible if you knew what to look for. Faster conversations. Shorter glances. Control tightening where it had once been relaxed. He knew. Maybe not everything. But enough. Ethan reached for the note again, running his thumb along its edge as if it carried more than just ink. Naomi had not just warned him. She had trusted him to understand the scale of what she was risking by doing it. Because people in her position did not interrupt systems like this unless they had already learned what it cost. Ethan pushed his chair back slightly, not standing, just creating space, a shift in posture. That signaled something was about to move. Across the room, Naomi saw it again. This time, her breath slowed, her shoulders settling just a fraction. Not relief. Readiness. Because whatever happened next would not stay hidden. Ethan picked up his phone once more, unlocked it, and this time, he did not hesitate. Not to call. Not yet. But to document. Photos. Quiet. Precise. The plate. The label glimpsed in reflection. The timestamp. Evidence collected in silence. Because when systems failed, the difference between noise and change was proof. And Ethan Caldwell had just decided this would not be a quiet correction. It would be a reckoning no one in that room saw coming. Do not serve table 12. The voice came through the kitchen headset, low but sharp, cutting through the rhythm of plates and orders like a quiet crack in glass. Ethan did not hear it directly, but he saw its effect. A line cook hesitated for half a second. A server paused mid-step. The manager turned too quickly, stepping into the kitchen with a smile that did not match the tension in his shoulders. Something had shifted behind those doors. Not enough for the room to notice, but enough for the system to react. Ethan remained seated, his posture relaxed, his face unreadable, but his attention locked onto the smallest changes. Because this was where truth revealed itself. Not in loud mistakes. In controlled corrections. The kind people made when they realized someone might be watching. He tapped his phone again, pulling up a secondary feed, internal communications tied to regional compliance logs. Nothing had been officially updated. No recall acknowledgement. No override authorization. Which meant whatever was happening now was not being recorded. It was being managed. Quietly. Carefully. The manager reemerged seconds later, adjusting his jacket, his expression polished back into place. He clapped once, lightly, signaling the floor staff with a confidence that felt practiced. Minor delay on a few orders, he said, voice smooth, almost reassuring. Kitchen is refining plating. A lie. Not dramatic. Not obvious. But a lie built to hold the room together. A couple nearby laughed it off. Someone lifted a glass. The illusion held. For now, Ethan watched as a different server approached table 12, not Naomi, but someone new, younger, less certain. The plate she carried was not steak. Fish. Substitution. Clean. Quick. Invisible to anyone who had not been paying attention from the beginning. But Ethan had. And Naomi had. Naomi stood near the edge of the room, her hands folded lightly in front of her, her posture calm, but her eyes tracking every movement with quiet precision. She was not surprised. She was confirming. Because this was the pattern. Not a mistake. A response. And responses revealed intent. Ethan leaned back again, slower this time, his gaze lifting toward the ceiling for just a moment, as if he were simply taking in the ambience. But in truth, he was thinking 3 steps ahead. If the recall had been ignored once, it had likely been ignored before. Not just here. Not just tonight. This was a decision that had history behind it, which meant exposure needed to be complete. Not partial. Not contained. He picked up his phone again, this time opening a different channel. Not public. Not external. Internal audit escalation. Level 3. The kind that did not trigger alarms immediately, but flagged patterns across locations, suppliers, timelines. Quiet at first. Then undeniable. His thumb hovered for just a second. Not hesitation. Precision. Then he pressed send. Across the room, nothing changed. The music continued. The lights stayed warm. The conversations flowed like nothing in the world had shifted. But behind the scenes, something had just begun to move. Systems waking up. Data cross-checking. Flags connecting where they had once been ignored. And Naomi felt it. Not through a screen. Not through a message. But through the way the room subtly tightened. The way the manager's confidence became just a fraction too controlled. The way the kitchen doors stopped swinging as freely as before. She did not look at Ethan. She did not need to. Because she already knew. He had chosen not to silence it. He had chosen to expose it. And in that choice, the balance of power in that room had quietly, completely shifted. The man who built the system had just turned it on itself. And the woman no one saw had been the one to start it. The first sign was not loud. It was precise. A subtle vibration on the manager's wrist as his smartwatch lit up with a notification he had not expected to receive. His smile held for half a second too long before it tightened. Just slightly. Just enough for someone trained to read pressure to notice. Ethan noticed. Naomi noticed. No one else did. The room still moved in its polished rhythm, but underneath it, something had begun to fracture. Quietly. Systematically. The kind of fracture that did not crack outward, but inward, pulling everything toward a point no one could see yet. The manager stepped aside, turning his back to the dining room as he checked his screen, his fingers moving faster now. Tapping, scrolling, pausing, then tapping again. His shoulders rose, then lowered, as if he were trying to breathe through something that had just become real. Because somewhere beyond this room, systems were connecting. Logs were being pulled. Patterns were being recognized. Not just here. Not just tonight. Across locations. Across shipments. Across decisions that had once felt small enough to ignore. Ethan remained seated, unmoved, his presence still blending into the background of wealth and quiet conversation. But his eyes had shifted. They were no longer observing the room. They were watching the reactions to something the room did not yet understand. A server passed by his table, her steps slightly quicker than before, her tray balanced but not as steady. Small things. Human things. Signals that pressure had begun to reach the surface. Naomi stood near the service station, her hands resting lightly against the counter, her posture unchanged, but her focus sharpened. She saw the manager glance toward the kitchen again. She saw the chef step closer, their conversation brief, controlled, but not calm. This was not confusion. This was containment. And containment only happened when something had already slipped beyond control. Ethan picked up his glass again, taking a slow sip, not because he needed the wine, but because it gave him time to watch without being watched. Across the room, a couple raised a toast. Someone laughed a little too loudly. The illusion was still intact, but it was thinning. The manager turned back toward the floor, his expression reset, but not perfectly. Not anymore. He scanned the room once, then again, his eyes landing on Ethan's table for just a fraction too long. Recognition did not come. Not of who Ethan was, but of where the problem might be anchored. Table 12. The untouched plate. The break in pattern. He started to move toward it, then stopped, redirected, choosing a different path, a different table, as if proximity itself might confirm something he was not ready to face. Naomi saw that too. The avoidance. The delay. She understood it instantly. People did not approach what they feared until they had no other choice. Ethan set his glass down, the soft sound barely audible, but final in its intention. Because the moment was approaching. Not loud, not dramatic, but inevitable. The kind of moment where systems stopped pretending and started revealing. His phone remained on the table, silent, but alive with processes now moving far beyond this room. Flags triggering audits. Audits triggering reviews. Reviews pulling names. Decisions. Signatures. A chain unraveling itself in real time. Naomi adjusted a single glass on the counter, aligning it with the others, her movements calm, deliberate, almost ritualistic. But her eyes lifted once more, just briefly, meeting Ethan's for less than a second. It was enough. Not agreement. Not relief. Just acknowledgement. The line had been crossed. And there was no returning to what this room had been pretending to be. Because somewhere behind the polished surface, truth was no longer waiting to be noticed. It was already being uncovered. And the people who had built their confidence on silence were about to learn what happened when someone finally chose to listen. We need to pause service on all steak orders. The voice came from the kitchen this time, not hidden behind a headset, not softened for discretion, but still controlled enough to sound like a decision rather than a crisis. It carried just far enough to reach the edge of the dining room, where it brushed against the atmosphere without fully breaking it. A few heads turned. Not many. Just enough. The manager stepped forward quickly, intercepting the moment before it could grow, his hands raised slightly, his smile returning with effort. Small supply issue, he said smoothly. We are offering alternatives tonight. Alternatives. The word landed gently, but it did not settle. Because alternatives were not part of a place like this. Not at this level. Not at this price point. The illusion was beginning to thin. Ethan remained seated, his posture unchanged, but his attention sharpened to a point that missed nothing now. The shift had moved from hidden to visible, from controlled to contained. And containment never lasted. A man 2 tables away frowned slightly at his new plate, tilting his head as if something did not quite add up. A woman beside him leaned in, whispering something that carried curiosity more than concern. The questions were small, but they had started. And once questions began, answers followed. Naomi moved through the room again, but her pace had changed, just enough to signal that she was no longer simply serving. She was navigating, watching how the staff adjusted, how the manager redirected, how the kitchen slowed its output just enough to appear intentional. She saw the patterns unraveling in real time, the same way she had seen them before, in places where speaking up had cost more than staying silent. But tonight was different. Because tonight, someone had listened. Ethan picked up his phone once more, not to check, not to confirm, but to observe the response now coming back through the system he had activated. Alerts were no longer isolated. They were connecting. Multiple locations flagged. Similar delays. Similar substitutions. A pattern no longer subtle enough to ignore. His eyes narrowed slightly, not in surprise, but in recognition of scale. This was not a single decision. It was a chain of them. Repeated. Protected. Allowed. And now exposed. Across the room, the manager's confidence continued to thin, each interaction costing him a little more control than the last. His voice remained steady, but his movements gave him away, quicker, sharper, less certain. He glanced again toward Ethan's table, longer this time, as if drawn by something he could not yet define. The untouched plate, the stillness, the absence of participation in the performance everyone else was still trying to maintain. Naomi noticed that too. She adjusted her path, placing herself briefly between the manager's line of sight and Ethan's table, not obvious, not defensive, just enough to interrupt the connection. A small move, but deliberate, because visibility, she knew, changed everything. Ethan saw it, understood it, and for the first time, he allowed himself the smallest shift forward, his hands resting flat against the table, his presence no longer blending, but beginning to anchor. Not loudly, not dramatically, but undeniably, because the moment had arrived where silence no longer protected anything. It only delayed the inevitable. A server approached another table with hesitation, offering an explanation that sounded rehearsed but felt incomplete. The guest listened, then leaned back, eyes scanning the room in a way that suggested awareness was spreading. Not panic. Not yet. But awareness. And awareness was enough. Ethan's phone buzzed once. A single notification. Internal audit escalation confirmed. Multi-location review initiated. Estimated exposure window expanding. He read it once, then locked the screen. That was all he needed. Across the room, Naomi slowed near the service station again, her eyes lifting one last time to meet his. This time, the look held just a fraction longer. Not a question, not a warning, a confirmation. The truth was no longer contained. It was moving, and in a room built on perfection, the smallest crack had just become impossible to ignore. The silence did not break. It shifted, subtle at first, like a change in air pressure before a storm no one can see yet, but everyone can feel. Conversation slowed. Laughter lost its edge. Glasses were lifted, but not always finished. Something in the room had moved beyond elegance and into awareness. Ethan Caldwell finally stood. Not abruptly, not dramatically, just a controlled rise, the kind that did not ask for attention but received it anyway. Chairs did not scrape. Voices did not stop. But eyes began to notice. The man at table 12 who had not touched his meal. The man who now adjusted his jacket with the calm of someone who was no longer part of the illusion. Across the room, the manager saw him. Really saw him this time. Not as a customer. Not as a table. But as a variable he could not place. And that uncertainty was enough. Ethan reached for the plate one last time. Not to eat. Not to inspect. But to turn it slightly, revealing the untouched surface to the light. A quiet statement. This was not consumed. This was not accepted. He left it there, exactly as it had been served. Evidence in plain sight. Naomi stood near the service station, her posture still, her hands relaxed, but her eyes fixed on him now without hesitation. There was no need for signals anymore. No need for subtlety. The moment had arrived where truth no longer needed to hide behind gestures. Ethan took a step forward, then another, moving through the room with a calm that did not match the tension beginning to ripple outward. He did not rush. He did not hesitate. Each step measured, deliberate, as if he had already seen how this would end long before anyone else realized it had begun. His phone buzzed again. He did not look at it. He did not need to. The system was already moving. The audit was no longer internal. Notifications had escalated. External compliance teams were being alerted. The chain that had once protected itself through silence was now unraveling through visibility. And it would not stop here. The manager stepped toward him, intercepting his path with a smile that no longer held. "Sir, if there is any concern, we can address it immediately," he said, his voice steady, but thinner now, stretched by something he could not control. Ethan stopped in front of him, close enough to be heard, far enough to avoid a scene. "You already did," Ethan replied. Simple, quiet, final. The words did not echo. They did not need to. Because in that moment, the manager understood something he had been avoiding since the first notification touched his wrist. This was not a complaint. This was exposure. Around them, the room continued, but not the same way. People were watching now. Not openly. Not yet. But enough. Enough to feel that something had shifted beneath the surface they trusted. Naomi stepped forward slightly, not toward Ethan, not toward the manager, but into a position where she was no longer hidden behind movement and trays and expectations. For the first time that night, she was visible. Not because she demanded it, but because the truth she carried had forced the room to look. Ethan turned his head just enough to meet her eyes one last time. No words. No acknowledgement spoken aloud. But something passed between them that did not need language. Respect. Recognition. Alignment. Then he walked past the manager, toward the exit, toward a night that would not stay quiet for long. Behind him, the room did not collapse. It recalibrated. Slowly. Uncomfortably. As if it had just realized perfection was never what it seemed. And the untouched plate remained on the table, cooling under the lights. A silent reminder that power is not proven by what you control, but by what you choose not to ignore.